You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Sharon Parker. Sharon is the Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow, a professor of organizational behavior at Curtin University, director of the Center for Transformative Work Design, and an honorary professor at the University of Sheffield. We discuss remote work in the COVID era. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Sharon Parker. Sharon, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Thanks. So we're going through this massive experiment all at once where we're taking a significant portion of the world's working population and throwing them in an online environment. There was obviously, very little planning that was able to put forth for this. And this is one of the greatest managerial challenges and employee shifts that we've ever seen. And you've done some phenomenal work in writing about this transition and how we can think of it. So just starting from a high level, how has this played out? What have been the effects of moving so much of our working population online?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right. It is like a giant experiment, really. And so researchers in my team here, we sort of got excited about this and immediately launched a study of people working from home during this time. And I guess in a nutshell, some people are faring really well and loving it and feeling more productive than ever. And then, of course, there are others who are really struggling. And I think the overall message, that I would like to convey in the podcast is that it really shouldn't be. We can certainly look at how people work from home successfully and what are some of the challenges. But in the end, it comes down to how good is the work, whether it's work in the office or whether it's work at home. How well designed is it? How much autonomy do people have? And these sorts of questions. And that's really what it boils down to in a nutshell. But absolutely radical change for people. And we're seeing the sort of effects of that now where companies are suddenly announcing, we're going to now abandon the office and so on and so forth. So radical change for sure.
So where have the successes been, and what kind of organizations or kinds of teams have struggled the most?
Yeah, so I guess one of the clear findings from our research is that there's probably about 20% to 1/3 of workers that are struggling for various reasons. And one of those reasons is because their managers are effectively sort of micromanaging them or tethering them to the desk in a sense. So, and we actually got interested in this because I was talking to a colleague who was just exhausted. And she said, whereas when she's in the office, her manager knows that she's working. And so, she can grab a cup of tea and it's fine and things. But she was finding when she was working from home, if she was just not immediately available to a call from her manager would make the assumption that she was off playing golf or still in bed or whatever. And, then start to be very controlling and directive. And we found actually when we looked at this phenomenon more broadly that, a number of people were feeling monitored by their bosses. So, those constant telephone calls or sometimes even wanting people to keep the screen on so that they could immediately respond. But also this pressure to be available at all times. And that's a phenomenon that we've seen sort of grow over time with the mobile phone anyway. This notion that you can be contacted any time and therefore you should be available anytime. But we saw for some people that became an even more acute problem during this time. And obviously people who feel that they're being micromanaged, who feel watched, it's going to add to their stress, and it did in this case. And it actually also undermines their performance because as you would know, it's not very conducive to your motivation if you have this sense that your manager is not trusting you and, needs to be checking up on you all the time.
Well, let's take that. Let's drill into motivation. So what have you found with employees who are working remotely? Are people feeling motivated? Are they finding themselves to be lazy? And I mean, some of the stuff that I've come across is that it's quite different when you have 2 weeks of remote work versus what might be 6 months or a year or 2 years. And so how do we think through this very real tension, which is in the workplace, when you're present in an office, you have a culture surrounding you, you have other people working on similar projects. And when you're working at home, it can feel very isolating. And you might have reason to believe as a manager that there is needed oversight in a way that you don't have in a physical workplace. So what are we seeing over time on some of these areas?
Yeah, and actually we just started analysing our data because we've actually collected survey data over 8 waves. Actually seeing quite a lot of stability so far. I mean, we haven't explored it fully, but I mean, your question about motivation, the fact is that people are in really different situations. So some people, for example, are having to work from home, even though really the work shouldn't be done at home. It's quite client facing, or it's manufacturing work or something like that. And so those people are sort of underloaded and bored and struggling to find enough to do. And then, there's the other extreme where people's businesses and work have sort of gone crazy and they're working huge long hours and under a lot of pressure. And then there are people who've got, like you, small children at home, and haven't necessarily been able to go to daycare and have children. And then there are some people who are introverted.
There is a meme going around Twitter that says there's 2 types of people. There's the type of people who think that work from home is the future, and those with little kids.
I could completely agree, and especially those with the little kids who don't have care, during this time.
Yeah, I mean, you might hear the pitter patter upstairs. Like you might.
Okay, I'll listen out for
it. Some pitter patter during this podcast. So that stays in. So sorry, go on.
And so, I mean, I guess the point is people's circumstances vary. The type of work they do varies. Their personalities vary too. So, some people loved being at home during this time and other people really suffered. So there's just a whole range of factors, personal factors, demographic factors, work factors that really shape people's motivation and mental health during this time. So there's not a sort of one reaction to this particular mode of working.
So then how does a team leader deal with this, right? So you have you have a small team that you're managing now remotely, and they're all in different life circumstances, right? You have some members of the team that are going to be motivated if they were on a boat trying to work, they'd still find the time to do it. And you have other members that for whatever varying degrees they're dealing with the coronavirus with family. How do you deal with the diversity of life situations during COVID in a remote situation?
Well, you can't manage all those people the same because their needs are going to be different. And so, in transformational leadership theory, which I'm sure you're familiar with, one of the dimensions is individualized consideration, which is this idea that you need to treat people as individuals and recognize their diversity and appreciate their differences. And that's probably never been as important as during this time. And it's been demanding time for managers. We talk in our research about how managers haven't, necessarily some of them haven't been very trusting of their employees and they need to develop. It's been very demanding for managers because there is this extra pressure to check in more with people, give people more support. And that's been important because, as you say, people are different and they've got different challenges and you need to talk one-on-one in a way to uncover those. And also it's been a time where people are worried, they might be worried about a partner losing their job. They might be worried about COVID with a family member. So, I'm sure this is true in the US as it is in Australia. Mental health has sort of skyrocketed. Mental health issues have skyrocketed. Yeah. So, managers are having to invest a lot more time in providing support. And I think that's really the critical factor here is sort of showing care and support to your workers, and that takes time, and managers need that support in turn from their managers, of course.
So have you found that how has performance borne out during this period are managers who are now thrust into this new environment, who many of whom have never done online management. They're used to, they might have 15 years of managerial experience in an office, and they've never done this, and they're thrown into a new position. How are the outcomes looking?
Yeah, so we found that about 20% to 1/3 of managers have really struggled. And partly they're just not used to managing people remotely. So I think managers have had to go on a very steep learning curve, many of them, during this time, because, as you say, they were sort of thrust into this situation with very little opportunity for preparation and training, and how to use the technology, how to give people that one-on-one care. And we found in our survey that the managers that struggled the most tended to, first of all, be male. They tended to be younger managers. They tended to be managers.
Why men? What's the gender difference?
Well, I think there's a sort of cluster of factors here. The other thing is that they were also tended to be more in those roles like manufacturing or administration or logistics. And so I think those are roles which are a bit more hands-on, and managers are much more familiar with managing people through line of sight. I mean, I think if you think about knowledge workers, for example, managers tend to be a bit more used to recognizing that you can't sort of, you don't have to watch a knowledge worker to see, to know whether they're working. So I think there was it's been particularly challenging for those managers in those sorts of roles. But, hopefully, by now there's more training and there's more guidance and there's more resources to sort of upskill these managers. Because in fact, it's a really important skill for the future. I mean, irrespective of working from home, we know that work is becoming more cognitive into the future. And we know that this more empowering style where you trust people and give them autonomy, it's actually going to become more important into the future rather than less. So it's a good skill for managers to acquire.
So there's been a split here on knowledge work, right? So the example that I think of is Facebook, right? They made an announcement that you can work from home, not for the next year, but indefinitely. And that for the forever future of Facebook, you can go work for Facebook and work from home. And that model has, during COVID, been assumed to work everywhere. You've seen, I mean, at least in New York Times and Vox, there was so much attention when that announcement came out that it was, everyone's going to at some point move to this kind of a model. And I was wondering, do you see a difference between Facebook doing this, where there's engineers getting paid $250,000 a year working remotely, versus the quote unquote knowledge-based work that maybe people making $40,000 a year, $50,000 a year, where how do you see that dichotomy?
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, that's a very specific sort of work, technology, software development. I know that there's collaborative components, but it can be done electronically very well, very effectively. And that's not true of all work. So it's very specific sort of work. As you say, it's a very specific sort of demographic. So highly educated people, probably highly self-motivated people on high income, so they can have their lavish offices and so on and so forth. And to expect that to apply for every sort of work and every sort of person, is sort of nonsensical. And I have heard, other companies during this time say, oh, well, we've discovered that people can be productive, when they're not working here, which, to be honest, we've known for years that if you trust people and give them autonomy, they often work better. But, it's this sort of magic discovery. And so, hey, we're going to get rid of offices. And I think that's a very sort of naive perspective too, because for one thing, it's not taking into account time. As you said earlier, Jeff, the reactions for a few months are quite different to those reactions for several years. It's also not taking into account some of the things that we know from research already. There's been a lot of research done on flexible working that are missed out on when people work from home. And one of the most important is the opportunity for people to collaborate face-to-face and solve complex problems face-to-face. and innovate too. You talk about the water cooler conversation, and we've had all this emphasis during COVID of trying to recreate it virtually and so on. And I think at first it was all novel and we did it, but I don't know how it was with you, but I know it faded off for us, and you sort of just stopped doing that after a while. And so I think that I sort of worry that we're going to throw out the baby with the bathwater, if we sort of say, oh, okay, we don't need offices, and let's just completely throw them away. Equally, we're going to lose something if we don't preserve some of those lessons that we've learned during this time, which is that people can be trusted, and that if people have autonomy and they have that flexibility and they save commuting time and, they work hard, there's great benefits to people's motivation and their ability to juggle homework things. So there's sort of good things with both worlds. And I worry sometimes that companies sort of jump on a bandwagon and they do it without really having thought about, well, is this really appropriate for our work, our people, our situation? And so I would be encouraging, and we've had quite a lot of companies come to us and say, well, what is the best mix? What we want to preserve some of this flexibility, but how much? What's ideal? And so we're encouraging them to do some experiments and measure these things, because we don't really know. I mean, the research from pre-COVID would sort of suggest that a couple of days a week seems to be the ideal. But of course, it's going to depend again on the type of work that you do in your organisation and lots of different factors. So I think we need to sort of experiment and evaluate and see what works. And so that's what we're encouraging organisations to do, not to jump onto one extreme or the other, and instead try to create some sort of hybrid model. But that's going to take some learning, because it's new for most organisations, and it's going to take some upskilling.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, the big challenge appears to be surrounding organizational identification, right? That it's very difficult for most people to feel committed to any kind of a company or organization if they're not present in it. And this seems to be the biggest challenge to running a completely digital operation, right? That it's hard enough to move beyond your own self-interest into the interests of a larger group. It's an immense challenge. It's one of the greatest organizational challenges that we have, is to get people to think beyond themselves and their own family. And that's when you are physically present and you have friends on the team, and you have been there for several years, and you know your colleagues' kids. It's still hard to do that. And my concern with this experiment, and we can set aside the Facebooks of the world, but just for a more typical smaller, medium-sized business, or even larger corporation, is that you have now thousands of people who, at the end of the day, view this as something that they're logging into, doing some work, and then leaving, and that emotional attachment, which influences their capacity for creativity, for taking on new projects, for thinking, for what we call organizational citizenship behaviors, just all of these soft things that move well beyond what's in your job description, that really make work what it is, which is, okay, so I've got these 13 things that I'm supposed to get done. But the truth is that in the morning before work, I'm actually thinking about these other ways that I can be helpful. When I'm talking with my colleagues at drinks, after work, we go out for drinks, and we're actually processing a lot of things that we're thinking about that are work related. Of course, we're also talking about friends and family and life and all these other things. But so much of what makes a modern organization larger than the sum of its parts, right? The people that become larger than their individual elements are these intangibles, and that's my concern. Is that something will be lost for these parts? Is there any way to measure or test these components? And I'd like to get your thoughts on kind of what I've just explored.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a very good point, and I've been thinking about it actually a little bit in terms of meaning of work. And I don't have any evidence to back this up, although we've got these measures in our study and we will look at it. But I have the sense that when people don't go into their workplace, it's harder to maintain that sense of why their work is important. and what its contribution is more broadly. And because I think that partly comes, that sense of meaning, I know that it comes from the value that you deliver to clients and things, but it partly comes from the validation and the conversations that you have with your colleagues. And when you're not having those same sort of informal, validating conversations, I think you do lose a little bit of a sense of meaning. And I think you're right, that connection with the bigger purpose of the organisation. I think the other factor that's important is, this idea of informal connection in work. And, it's actually very interesting because we're all now back in the office. And when we made it voluntary for people to go back when they wanted, because we didn't want to impose, because a lot of people had worries about health and stuff. But so we made it voluntary that when people come back when they want. And for about the first month, we really didn't have enough people actually coming back in. And then the people that were coming back in started to say, oh, well, I was coming back in because I wanted to connect with people, but people are not here. And, so I'm not going to come in now. And then we had to intervene and say, hang on, this is not working actually, because unless we get a sort of critical mass of people.
These are Perth companies?
Yeah, this is in our university, right? Yeah, okay. But all Perth companies are now back at work, I think most of them. And I actually talked to quite a few organisations with the exact same problem. And then funnily enough, I found a research article that showed this exact phenomenon, which is that there's a sort of contagion thing that happens. So if not many people are coming into work because you allow everyone to just come in one day a week or something, the problem is when people do come in, they come in for connection and for talking to people, and then there's no one there. And so then they say, well, I'm not going to come in. And so the article talked about this contagion of remote working, and it was great because it was really our exact experience. So I had to have a conversation with my team and sort of say, guys, what are we going to do? Because this isn't really working. And we came up with some ideas, and it's all fine now. And we very much decided to go down the path of let's not coerce people to come in, let's motivate people to come in. And that's sort of paid off, and now it's sort of back to normal. But I mean, I think it shows how it's a sort of delicate balance between, allowing people freedom and choice and flexibility, but also getting that sort of critical mass so that people can have the connection that's so important to human psyche, but also so important to things like innovation. I mean, as you say, that sort of accidental conversation is really important for generating ideas and not even just ideas, but generating an energy and enthusiasm for ideas. So, we need that in organisations. And I think perhaps some of these companies like Trello and stuff that are completely, everyone is remote working, maybe they have had, enough time and enough learning to figure out how to really do it well. But most of us haven't, so we're still in that space where some sort of hybrid is going to be the best.
So where does this go from here? Eventually we will, in some form or another, have taken care of COVID. I'm assuming some point in 2021, it's between therapeutics and even a weak vaccine, it will be in the background. So what's the legacy in terms of work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, it's really interesting to me because before COVID, the whole digitalization agenda was really ramping up, and it was huge. Every week, every day, there'd be an article about automation and AI and how it was going to replace jobs. And funnily enough, that sort of conversations is gone. And we've been talking instead about remote working. But of course, the digitalization has gone on, accelerated in some places, in manufacturing, for example. So, I mean, I think coming out of this, there's obviously the question about remote working, and we're going to see some companies who are going to sort of abandon the office and then probably realise that that was a bit extreme and then pull back. We're going to see some companies that are going to just resort back to normal. So just to give an example, today actually, a company that we are working with, they were working 50% at home during COVID, and the managers supported a request to the board to continue 50% remote working. So post-COVID, which is we are sort of here in Perth, and it was declined because the board thought that would lower productivity. So there are going to be some companies who do just go back to the normal. And then, of course, there's hopefully going to be the bulk in the middle that are going to work out how to get the best of both worlds. And that's what I'm really hoping, that will be a bit of a game changer. And I mean, there are bigger factors that come into this too. It's not just about those things we've talked about. It's things like, commuting times are getting longer, the impact of the environment on everyone commuting to work all the time. There are these other big factors as well that are sort of pushing towards more remote working, more flexible working anyway. But I do see ahead in the not too distant future that we're going to have to grapple with some of the big challenges that are happening with AI, and the sort of automation and digitalization that's happening. So yeah, I don't think it's going to be very long after COVID where that's going to really come back onto the table. And there are some really big issues, both good and bad, positive and negative for work, that we need to be getting much more involved in, I think, as organizational people.
What are your big concerns about AI?
So I think in many respects, it has the potential to really make work better. We might see examples in surgery or whatever, where we're really harnessing big data and making work better. But we also are already seeing examples of things like algorithmic management, where actually work is becoming much more tightly controlled. So, we've been talking about autonomy and the importance of autonomy during remote work. Into the future, we are going to see some real threats to autonomy in the workplace, not from managers, but from algorithms, right?
Yeah, for the future, it's already there.
It's already there, and it's just going to happen more.
The ability for organizations to turn on monitoring. There have been some incredible podcasts that have, I think there was one out by the Wall Street Journal that was looking at the tools that some companies use to monitor employee productivity, which include everything that they're doing, what website and then getting back to them. And even if they have a relationship problem, they will, because they're reading over their emails, HR will come and comment about their boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse I think we're already.
So I think these are going to be huge issues in the future. So I guess the way that we see it and the way that we're looking at it in our research is, it's not that technology is not good or bad, but neither is it neutral. And by that, I mean, it can be used for good or evil. But we've got to be much more proactive, I think, as organizational psychologists and organizational people in really influencing that discussion and debate. And I think so far we haven't been particularly. I definitely think those issues are going to be on the horizon very strongly into the future.
All right. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.